Thanks for coming. We have some very interesting subject matter today. Leo's just returned, Leo Panitch, to my left. Probably most people know, has just returned from the UK, where he participated in the Momentum Conference and attended the Labour Party conference as well. The leadership of the UK Labour Party by Jeremy Corbyn continues to enjoy enormous popularity across the UK. This even despite continual attacks from the corporate press, the Conservative Party, and opposition from within the parliamentary Labour Party itself. Indeed, under Corbyn's leadership, the Labour Party has once again become a mass party, with a larger membership than any other social democratic party across Europe. Moreover, grassroots activism and direct participation in the party by members has grown to levels not seen in recent history, especially since the party's centralization under the Third Way leadership of Tony Blair. This active engagement by the grassroots constituency has helped Corbyn and the party's socialist left capture key institutional positions and to consolidate their power within the party to some extent. Yet serious challenges remain. Even though the recent Labour Party conference saw some gains accrue to Corbyn and the left, so too were their trade-offs and setbacks. So I introduced Leo Panitch, who was in Liverpool to observe developments at the Labour Party conference and to speak and participate in Momentum's The World Transformed festival there, who will assess the opportunities and challenges faced by Corbyn and his social movement supporters in pursuing the project to democratize the Labour Party and transform British politics. So we'll also hopefully have the chance to consider some of the implications for the international left as well. So with that, I turn it over to Leo.
Okay, thanks, Steve. What's going on in the Labour Party, I should begin by saying, is very unique to the Labour Party. And people should be very careful about generalizing from it. European social democracy is in probably its worst crisis in its century-and-a-half history, with the leading social democratic parties experiencing vote levels below 20% for the first time probably since World War I, if not earlier. So one really needs to be careful about this, and for me to say, moreover, that what's going on in the Labour Party shows some promise in socialist terms is, of course, highly ironic for me, because I made a living saying you couldn't change the Labour Party into a socialist party. I did a PhD there in the early 1970s on the conflict between the Labour government and the trade unions around wage restraint when Labour was in office, very similar to what happened with Bob Rae here. I observed closely, even after I came back to Canada, the long struggle out of that conflict with the unions, with Labour's own base, the long struggle that was known as the Bennite struggle, or the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, or the Greater London Council at the municipal level and other cities as well, to democratize the Labour Party and to turn it away from its dogmatic parliamentarism, its obsession with parliamentary procedure, and its bureaucratic statism. And in 1979, the first article I ever published in the Socialist Register was called Socialism and the Labour Party. It was a critique of an article that Ken Coates of the Institute of Workers' Control had written in 1973, urging those outside the Labour Party on the left to come into it rather than go into trying to build better Leninist parties or non-Stalinist communist parties, which a lot of the left was doing. And he ended his piece in '73 by saying, where have you seen a mass socialist party created outside of a traditional Labour social democratic party in the last number of decades? And I ended my '79 piece saying, in response to that, where have you seen a social democratic party transformed into a socialist one? And that has pretty well been my position. It was very rapidly confirmed when Bennism was defeated, partly because the left trade unions pulled the plug on it in 1981. And in the wake of that defeat, the soft left of the Labour Party, led by Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, who became leader, turned their backs on the miners in the Great Miners' Strike. and paved the way, I think, for Blairism and the Third Way. They tried to hold on to the social democratic Keynesian welfare state when it was no longer viable to do so by the 1980s. By the 1990s, the pragmatic parliamentarians who coined the term the Third Way, were really following Bill Clinton, decided that in the context of globalization there was nothing you could do except embrace capital movements, except open yourself up to marketization and hope that there'd be some crumbs left in government revenues that you might possibly distribute, even while you were marketizing the state, the NHS, etc. So for me to be invited to speak at even at a fringe meeting of the Labour Party conference is kind of bizarre. I wrote a book with Colin Lees, it was published just as Blair came in, called The End of Parliamentary Socialism. Trying to show that, the end was there both in the sense that parliamentarism couldn't yield socialism, but also in the sense that even the Labour Party had abandoned any pretense that it could under Blair, very openly, very explicitly. And most famously, what Blair accomplished even before he was elected into government was to get rid of the famous Clause 4 in the Labour Party's constitution introduced in 1918, which commits the party to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange under the best popular form of popular administration, of democratic administration. That was removed from the party constitution, and a vague reference essentially to class collaboration, but also had the phrase in it, for the many, not the few, was replaced that socialist commitment. So for suddenly there to be in the Labour Party, alone in the world among social democratic parties, a explicitly socialist leader surrounded by a small group of comrades, very small, who survived the defeat of the Greater London Council, the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, the Bennite movement in the 70s. Is a surprising and in many ways remarkable and obviously very fraught thing. It is part of what Sam and I, in this little book, this little pamphlet we put out this year, in which was discussed at the World Transform meeting that Momentum organizes at party conferences. It represents the shift we've seen from protest to politics since Occupy, which is very significant, and you see it in the Sanders developments in the United States. You saw it with Syriza and Podemos in Spain. It's part of that shift from protest to politics that the Labour Party now has 550,000 members, having had under 200,000 before Corbyn announced his candidacy for the leadership. It's seen in the fact that the organization created to support his election as leader, Momentum, by someone who had been Tony Benn's campaign manager, John Lansman, as a very young man, at 23, 24 years old, in 1981, for the deputy leadership. It has 45,000 members, some claim 50. And this is an activist organization oriented not only to being a rent-a-crowd at demonstrations, and not only doing what it very effectively did in knocking on doors in the last election campaign, but is explicitly oriented to trying to link local Labour parties to local working class campaigns. Tenants issues, health issues, etc. So this is remarkable, but it's unlike anything else going on, one has to say, in social democracy in Europe, and it's obviously unlike anything going on in Canada, in the NDP. John Riddell dropped me a note asking whether an interview I had done there, saying far too loosely that my generation had failed to try to found a mass socialist party out of, beyond social democracy and beyond the Leninist parties. We have, there was something that we tried to set out to do in the 1970s, and we haven't accomplished it. And the fact that this has been rekindled inside the Labour Party is, something that is very sobering. On the other hand, as I said to John, what Quebec Solidaire shows is that in Canada the prospects may better be to do it outside of social democracy. So one has to be very careful about this, I think, and I want to introduce that by saying it. Very specific things led to this development where the Labour Party of all parties is now led by committed, campaigning socialists, by a few of them at least. And it partly has to do with the fact that there was nowhere else for activists to go from the movements when this shift from protest to politics happened. The fact that you have, like in Canada, a first past the post system rather than proportional representation has meant that, unlike in Germany, where you have Die Linke, unlike in Spain, where the Euro-communists threw up a very interesting Euro-communist party in the early 80s, and then it has been shoved aside somewhat by Podemos, where you don't, even in Sweden, where there now is a communist party that is doing very well as the mainstream parties, including the greatest social democratic party anywhere, the Swedish Social Democratic Party, is crumbling, losing its working class supporters often to the far right. But the Communist Party has done very well in recent elections. There was no place else really for a movement activist to go. And that had a lot to do with the fact that it took this direction. It secondly had to do with the explicitness of the Blair governments being in the back pocket of the American empire in the context of the mess it has made of the Middle East after 9/11. Determination with which Blair threw his support behind the American empire opened the door, because British socialism has always had this anti-imperialist orientation, more than it's perhaps had a socialist orientation, British Labourism. And the Iraq War was a tremendous shock to the membership. And to people more broadly on the left who voted Labour. So that is a very important factor as well. Of course, a third factor was the fact that when the global financial crisis happened, the fact that London is at the center of global finance, that the whole British economy is so dependent on the role of the City of London in providing the financial infrastructure for integrated global production and trade. And in many respects is the leading subsidiary of Wall Street in doing so, with the leading American investment banks playing a crucial role in this. The fact that this blew up in the face of a social democratic government, which had been so linked to, we need to integrate with the role of the City of London, we need to promote it, we need to encourage it, etc. And it was left having to bail out, nationalize two of the biggest, most important banks in the world, Lloyd's and what had been National Westminster, now is known as the Royal Bank of Scotland. But did so in a way that was utterly capitalist. bailed them out, nationalized them, and told them they had to behave as full commercial banks, returning a profit so they could be privatized again as soon as they did. Which was the explicit statement of the leader by then, who was Brown, who was seen somewhat to the left of Blair. But of course, you couldn't put a piece of litmus paper between them ideologically. He had more of a working class background, and historically, he'd actually been more of a socialist. So those were the special circumstances that I think began to set the tone for this. And you saw this with Ed Miliband, ironically, the son of Ralph Miliband, who wrote the book on parliamentary socialism, on Labour's dogmatism in parliamentarist terms, but the least dogmatic in socialist terms. His son became leader of the party on an explicitly anti-third way position. He had the support of the Iraq War. He had the support, somewhat reluctantly, of the unions, but he was the most viable of the establishment candidates who took a critical position on the third way and on imperialism. He immediately took his distance from the unions, not least because one of the elements that's very important in what has transpired is that a new generation of somewhat left-wing leaders started getting elected in the unions around 2005, 2006. But he took his distance from them because he was afraid of being labeled the way Bennett being labeled as the holding the hand of revolutionary trade unionists, of class struggle trade unionists. His orientation was to try to shift the party back to a more social welfarist orientation, a less imperialist one, a less financialized one, but one that was desperately trying to hold the party together. And he committed himself to continuing with balanced budgets and austerity. And he was, even though he went to some trade union meetings, which a labor leader hadn't done for 20 years, since the miners' strike, he went to the Durham Miners Rally and spoke and so on. Nevertheless, he kept his distance from the unions. And in fact, it was precisely that produced, totally accidentally, a change in the electoral system that allowed Corbyn to get elected. It was a fluke. Unite, the most left of the British unions, comes out of the Transport and General Workers, had elected a leadership that was in strong supporter of the Stop the War coalition, and was generally, it would self-describe itself as socialist, although I'll talk a little about how one needs to be very careful with this. That union had supported the girlfriend of the union leader to run in a labor by-election as a candidate. This was treated, and they had put all the union weight behind doing so. Whenever the union does that in a local election in Britain, the Labour right goes to the Guardian and the BBC, and it leaks into the public urinal that the unions are trying to dictate to the Labour Party. There was this ugly side to it, which wasn't open, which was that there was a personal relationship between the candidate and the General Secretary of the union that was known privately but not publicly, which is one of the things I think that scared Ed Miliband. But the general thing was, I need to distance myself from the union. And what he did was set up an inquiry, which led to the further reduction of the union role in the Labour Party. Blair had been trying to do this all through his leadership, had achieved it to a significant extent in terms of policy making, tried by taking money from whatever capitalist would give money to the Labour Party to not be reliant on the unions for funds, but never succeeded in that respect. So what Miliband did, or what was done under Miliband by the National Executive Party, was to move further away from union influence by introducing a one-member, one-vote system in the election of the leader of the Labour Party. It used to be the case that only parliamentarians voted on who would be leader of the Labour Party. This is unheard even here in Canada. The Tories and the Liberals are a mass enough party that they, like the NDP, have a general, either delegate vote or a general membership vote, right? But in Britain was so parliamentarist that only the Parliamentary Labour Party elected the leader. And given the autonomy of the elected MPs from the party apparatus, that was the rationale for it. One of the victories of the campaign for Labour Party democracy was that an electoral college was introduced, where 1/3 of the votes for leader went to the unions, 1/3 went to the constituency party delegates, and 1/3 went to the parliamentarians. When you introduced one person, one vote, that jumped all over all of those levels. Right. It was done on the assumption that party activists and union activists are far to the left of the average interested citizen. And if you were going to have one person, one vote, and you encourage people to join as members, as the Liberal Party does, or the Tories do in any election campaign, you would be getting middle-of-the-road people at best. You'd be getting kind of guardian readers kind of positions. Far from that happening. When Ed Miliband resigned after doing very badly in the 2015 election, and a leadership campaign happened, what was left of the parliamentary party's control, which is not significant, is that in order to run as leader, you had to get 15%, 35 votes from the Parliamentary Labour Party. You had to be nominated by parliamentarians. You couldn't be nominated by any of the mass membership, by the unions. You could only be nominated by parliamentarians. Lo and behold, I mean, there had been a small remnant of Benites left in the Labour Party, of campaigning socialists. Corbyn was one of them. John MacDonald was perhaps the most coherent of them in socialist terms as a Marxist. Diane Abbott was one of them, the black feminist socialist close to Corbyn. And each of them had taken their turn in running for previous election, leadership elections, and it was kind of Corbyn's turn. He had never done it. Now, we said I wouldn't be very good at it. MacDonald just had a heart attack. He didn't want to do it again. Okay, I'll do it, he said. Astonishing, he got the 35 votes for nomination, partly because right-wing Labour MPs thought that they should look liberal. You know, yeah, let's have a broad array of representatives. There's no chance this guy can get elected. And indeed, when he got nominated, I was excitedly written to by a young activist and young leader, one of the key people in founding Momentum, saying, Corbyn got nominated. And I wrote back and said, well, that's very nice, but you know he can't get elected. Well, how wrong I was. And what happened with one member, one vote, because of this shift from protest to politics, was that people who had been involved in the anti-globalization campaigns, in the Stop the War Coalition, in Stop the Cuts in Britain, which was very creative often with occupations of offices and sometimes Regent Street, department stores, etc. You saw this flow of people into the Labour Party. And moreover, they were so sure that anybody who signed up just to vote for leader would, you know, be a centrist at best, that they allowed people in this new system of voting to pay £3 and just become a supporter of the party and vote as well. To their great surprise, with the meeting in a London theatre where there were perhaps 5,000 people standing outside in Islington, which is where Corbyn's constituency is, trying to get in, there was this groundswell of excitement and support. And it was because Corbyn, much more than the others, had been perhaps the most visible campaigner as an MP. He had used his position as an MP as someone who would take his soapbox and go to stop the war, pro-Palestinian, stop the cuts, stop the marketization of the NHS meetings. So activists knew who he was, or at least the leaders of movements knew who he was, and it created this enormous enthusiasm, right? And lo and behold, he got elected. This was a shock to the system of the Labour Party. And even though he got support from the unions, they initially were not going to support him. Initially, they were picking, as they had with Ed Miliband, the most labor-oriented of the establishment MPs. That's true even of Unite. When it was clear that Corbyn was getting this massive support, he then was providing the support from the left-wing union leadership. Okay. Very special thing. The organization that was created to mobilize, help cohere this inflow of activist members to the Labour Party, which has now reached 550,000, was called Momentum. And I got first invited to a Labour Party conference 2 years ago in Liverpool in 2016, when they revolutionized the Labour Party conference. They created a parallel conference called the World Transformed, which was seen as not an opportunity, as had always been the case in the Labour Party, for Labour MPs to leave the Labour Party conference and come speak to the unwashed masses, mostly the party delegates, because who else went to Labour Party conferences? Maybe some local people where the conference was held. Instead, they created a 4-day meeting, which was largely educational, which was heavily cultural. There wasn't one room where there wasn't a really radical, creative, cultural installation of some kind. A sculpture, a painting, sometimes even a piece of singing or a piece of pop art, radical theater. And the type of people they invited ranged from Naomi Klein to radical Keynesians, to old Marxists like myself. And I was astonished when I went there that people started walking up to me and saying, I read your book and we're going to prove you wrong. When Colin and I published The End of Parliamentary Socialism, it was dropped into largely a vacuum. It was exactly when Blair had consolidated his power, and we showed that he had and how he had, and how this was the end of parliamentary socialism. And suddenly, with the Corbyn thing, a lot of these people have picked it up and started reading it, because it is the most detailed account of the attempt to change the party from the inside, and how it failed and why it failed. So this was indicative of something. At that conference, the moment was dominated by the attempt to overthrow Corbyn's leader, orchestrated by the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party and the vast majority of Corbyn's shadow cabinet, who signed a open letter demanding a new leadership election on the grounds that he, A, had not been an enthusiastic supporter of Remain at the time of the Brexit referendum, and B, that he didn't want to bomb Libya. Ironically, it was Tony Benn's son who led the campaign in favor of bombing Libya, and the attack on, which was the immediate thing, that led to the attempt to bring Corbyn down. Again, there was an election. Same thing happened again. Enormous number of members came into the party. Enormous number of supporters, although the people inside the Labour Party apparatus, whose main expertise is to expel people for being too radical, expelled a lot more people that time, but still it was enough people to overwhelmingly ensure that Corbyn would get re-elected again. So when I was there in 2016, that moment was one of excitement around the fact that he was now established as leader. And then at last year's party conference, which was in Brighton, not in Liverpool, to which I wasn't invited to speak at the World Transformed, there was enormous enthusiasm over the fact that the Labour Party had secured 40% of the vote in the election last year, when everyone had been saying, this guy is a disaster, he doesn't look like a politician, and he doesn't have the support of his own parliamentary party. He secured the largest increase in a Labour Party vote since 1945. And it was done, it was partly him and his anti-politician kind of attitude, character, that would prove popular to people. But it was also a number of other things. It was the explicitness of the party manifesto on we will stop austerity. Secondly, and absolutely explicit, where Labour had always felt they had to show themselves to be fiscally responsible. Insofar as they were going to be fiscally responsible, it would be by increasing taxes on the wealthy by 5% and increasing corporation taxes. Secondly, an absolute commitment to stop the marketization and privatization of the NHS. Thirdly, to bring public utilities, which opinion polls had shown was popular for a very long time, which had been privatized. The railways, energy, water, under Thatcherism, back into public ownership. And under a form of administration which would be popular, unlike the old form of nationalized industries, which were so heavily run from the top by either old managers of the private corporations or by technocrats. That was one thing, that the manifesto was very clear in its anti-austerity orientation and very open in its promise to bring back into public ownership these basic services and basic needs. But secondly, what led to that success was the tremendous inventiveness of momentum in the election campaign. The party apparatus, convinced from the polls that they were going to get slaughtered, put all of its resources into defending as many sitting MPs as possible. And given who was in the party apparatus, the center-right MPs as much as possible. Momentum did its own examination of what seats were marginal and sent people to canvass where the party apparatus was telling them not to go. Number one, and that proved very successful. You had these enthusiastic campaigners on the doorstep. And often they were speaking at least radical, if not socialist line. Secondly, they did a media campaign, above all through the internet, which Momentum is especially good at. And they have a tremendous list of people to reach through this growth in the membership of the Labour Party, which Momentum has tracked better than anybody. To give you an example, such was the transformation of the Labour Party that Ken Loach, the Marxist filmmaker, who had just tried in 2014 to create a new party called Left Unity after the Trotskyist movement in Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party, had finally collapsed under the own weight of its being past its prime, if you like to put it mildly. They had tried to found a new party called Left Unity, and Loach was one of the key figures in doing so. Well, there he was now, a member of the Labour Party, a strong supporter of Corbyn, producing a video for the Labour Party, which was good, and it showed a lot of ordinary people, ordinary workers, ordinary people, but especially ordinary workers saying, I want the fruits of my labor. It was okay, it was good. But Momentum put out a video which was seen by almost half of Facebook users in Britain, which went like this. It was entirely satirical. There's a picture of a fireman, and this is before the terrible fire in London. Before the Grenfell fire. A fireman coming out of a fire, all black, torn in this, and he looks up and says, I'm paid too much. And there's a picture of a care worker unlocking an apartment door and walking down a long corridor to an old man sitting on the bed waiting for her to come and take him to the bathroom. And she looks up and says, I'm paid too much. And then there's a picture of a policeman fighting with a thief, and he looks over his shoulder and says, I'm paid too much. And then behind them is a city guy in a pinstripe suit, a bowler hat, and an umbrella going into a Regent's Park mansion. And he turns around and says, I'm not paid enough. And that was the end.
Brilliant.
It was done by a 42, 43-year-old, Sam and I met him, technician, filmmaker, who was working for Momentum for virtually nothing, right? That's the kind of person you'd find in the office. So this kind of thing had an effect, and it was a tremendously, I think, creative politics. After the excitement last year of Corbyn having done well, this year's conference and this year's World Transformed parallel conference was in a way much more serious. It was about, well, what the hell do we really need to do to change the Labour Party so it could actually be the kind of party that would prepare for a radical, let alone a socialist government? What would we need to do to develop the kind of policy apparatus, the kind of policy program that would at least introduce the kind of reforms that would open up to further reforms? And what was on the party's own agenda for this party conference was a report called the Democracy Review, which was much pushed by the Momentum activists. We published as a bullet, I think we were the only place in the world to publish this, a marvelous statement on how to democratize the young labor wing of the Labour Party by a guy called Max Shanley. And if you look it up, it was in a bullet. It was marvelous, and it focused above all on what kind of structure do we need for political education, political education, political education. How do we make the people who are elected to positions accountable, but accountable in the sense that they're oriented to going out to do political education. And this democracy review was presented to this party conference. Now, it was disappointing. It was full of good stuff on how more disabled people, more people from BAME, which is the black member section of the party, more women should have representation in the party organizations, or a better chance at becoming members of parliament. But it was exactly that typical type of liberal representationism. Nothing wrong with any of that. Moreover, it didn't have any of the kind of socialist purpose in a land that was in this Young Labour Party document that we published. The only little piece of it that had any excitement or land was a few sentences they borrowed from Max Shanley's in the section on Young Labour, where they actually used his political education, political education, political education. It was disappointing. Moreover, a very interesting and important, but not surprising, division emerged around the democracy question at the party conference itself. And that was around the question of whether there should be automatic reselection, what is known as mandatory reselection, of a member of parliament. That is, if you're already an MP, do you automatically get the chance to run again, even if people in your constituency don't like what you've done? Or do you have to stand again for nomination? Well, in most places it's taken for granted, including here in Canada. It's true most incumbents win again. They've got name recognition. They go to all the birthday parties. In the United States, they've got loads of money behind them because they're congressmen and so on. In the Labour Party, that's not the case. And it's been a big divisive issue going back to the 1970s around whether this would be allowed to happen. There was some changes made in the late 80s that allowed, if 2/3 of party branches said they wanted to get rid of their MP, which involved a mobilization against him, then you could have an open election. So of course, as soon as you did that, the Guardian would be full of purges going on in the Labour Party against good, respectable members of Parliament by the crazy, by the militants, by the Marxists, by the anarchists, etc. A division occurred between the unions who were prepared to reduce what it would take to get rid of your MP to 1/3 of the branches having to say they didn't want you anymore, which is fairly easy to do. Right? And the activists, the Constituency Labour Party activists, who wanted the fully democratic thing. The National Executive Committee now has a majority of Corbyn supporters. The Constituency Labour Party people are all Momentum-backed people, members of Momentum, etc. The union leaders on the National Executive Committee are mostly on the left. They decided they would go for this compromise. That is, you now would only need 1/3. And the leader of Momentum, one of the leaders of Momentum, John Landsman, said okay. Corbyn's office went along with this and said okay. And there was a stitch-up, as there always is at party conferences. And all that was going to be presented to the party conference was this proposal to reduce it from 2/3 to 1/3 of branches to get rid of an MP. And the constituency delegates revolted. With everyone's amazement and surprise. I talked to a union leader, an ex-communist, very senior in Unite, and he was really pissed off with Momentum, the Momentum leadership, especially Landsman. I couldn't tell whether he was pissed off because he thought Landsman had stabbed them in the back and had mobilized the constituency delegates to vote as they did, or whether because he couldn't control his army. And I think it was because he couldn't control his army. This is extremely interesting and important because I've always worried that just as it was the left-wing leaders in the early 80s who pulled the plug on the Bennite Greater London Council movement to democratize the party, that it might be these left leaders who would pull the plug. They would do so partly out of being pragmatic, partly of being solidaristic, partly of not wanting to divide against union leaders that aren't as enthusiastic about democratizing. Partly because they're always afraid of, do we divide the union politically? Right? So this is a very interesting and troubling straw in the wind. On the other hand, what was going on at the World Transform meetings was a process of promotion of further democratization. Including people like MacDonnell coming and urging the activists, 6,000 people attend the World Transform meetings, and urging them to go out and do what's necessary to reselect their MP, but do it in a way that links up with campaigns in their constituencies. So it's not just a coterie of activists in the constituency that does this. Of course, people like myself and Hillary Wainwright, etc., were also making this kind of push. So there was support there for carrying the democratization thrust further, and I think it will be carried further. And above all, carrying it away, and I think people really heard this, that it involved not only political education to the people you are recruiting and working with in campaigns, that it has to involve political education upwards. What was really remarkable about the third way people, about the Blairites, was that they put an enormous amount of effort into educating Labour MPs into Thatcherism, into globalization. They educated these people to accept the third way, to accept getting on with marketization. What is not taking place in the Labour Party, but needs to, and it isn't even promoted by Momentum, is that we need to educate these center-left MPs, let alone get rid of the right MPs. No one's talking getting rid of the center-left MPs, who are, will exist with Corbyn as far as they're concerned. And that's a marked difference. It's a real, I think it's indicative of a problem. And you see how great a problem it is in this. I'll just give you this one example. One of the young women, she's 39 years old, who is touted as a successor to Corbyn, who is in his late 60s and can't go on forever, is a woman called Rebecca Long Bailey. She's the shadow minister of industry. She works extremely closely with MacDonald, who is the closest thing to a Marxist in this whole enterprise. She's from a working class constituency from Salford. When this controversy was going on, leading up to this sharp division between the unions and the constituency delegates over reselection, she was quoted in The Guardian as saying, well, one of the things that's wrong with reselection is that it takes members of Parliament's attention away from Westminster, i.e. away from Parliament. Yeah, duh. Like, that's the point of it. But it shows you the effect that this gentleman's club that Parliament has on left-wing MPs once they get in there. And so the education needs to go on upwards as well as downwards, and it's not. It's really not. In policy terms, there's been now it's accepted. It's now suddenly become, okay on the part of the right-wing MPs to say we will not have austerity. Suddenly they all sound like post-Keynesian economists. Having nailed Ed Miliband's soul to the flag of we need to be fiscally responsible when he was inclined not to in order to hold his shadow cabinet together. They now have, okay, we're all in favor of this. None of them speak against the nationalization. None of them attack Corbyn or piss into the public urinal any longer around democratizing industry. Because they always say we won't just renationalize this, we'll put workers on the boards, we'll put community representatives on the boards, etc. What they have been trying to get him on, as you all know, was anti-Semitism. And in the run-up to the party conference, this was all over the press. I have to tell you, above all, it was all over The Guardian and the BBC, not so much over the right-wing press. And it's because when an MP leaks into the Guardian urinal that Corbyn is an anti-Semite, they know that they're going to get publicity in the Guardian. That's their constituents. The Guardian was also very anti-Bennite in the 1970s and early 80s. Nobody really takes it seriously, including the people who are making the accusation. It is a product of the end of the prospect of a two-state solution. Corbyn has always been a supporter of Palestinian rights, but he's always been a supporter of the two-state solution. And what really is being orchestrated here, and the Israeli government, the Israeli embassy played a direct role in it, involves a attempt to label activists in the Labour Party and Corbyn who say that they are in favor of a Palestinian state, in that sense are just holding on to the two-state solution, to label them as anti-Semites. They partly do so because most activists no longer are in favor themselves of a two-state solution. Right? And insofar as that's a slippery slope, they're able to find words or phrases on the part of Corbyn or on the part of Labour Party activists, which indicates that they would go, be in favor of a fully democratic binational state, right? Which they immediately then interpret as driving the Jews into the sea. It's cynical, it's vindictive, it has no broad electoral impact, really none. It will lose them a couple of seats where in North London, where there's a heavy Jewish constituency, but even Thatcher, who was from that constituency, had to look over her shoulders at this whenever she was critical of Israel. But in the press, this was the biggest thing blown up. And the tragedy of it is that created a bubble inside Corbyn's office. They were constantly dealing with fighting this fire rather than trying to think through where they needed to go programmatically and in terms of changing the party more actively. Now, to be fair, so in that sense they got caught in what you might call is the Westminster bubble or the media bubble around this all through the summer. It was hardly voiced at the Labour Party conference. Certainly wasn't voiced at all at the TWT, the World Transform. And now it's gone silent, except in all places, the Toronto Star, which last week had a piece by Rabbi Maher resuscitating this, but totally ignoring Corbyn's speech to the conference, where he gave this fulsome guarantee to the Jewish community that the Labour Party has been the most anti-racist institution in Britain through its history, he himself has always stood against every form of racism, including anti-Semitism, that they would stand with Jews against any desecration of their communities, their synagogues, etc. This went on for 500 words. And then when he got to the foreign policy part of the speech, saying that he stood with the security of Israel as a state, but the first thing they would do as a government is recognize a Palestinian state. So, saying that in the speech, and it got a lot of attention in Britain, for that to be ignored in the Toronto Star is, rather bizarre, since it can't be done now even in a British newspaper. But there you have it. Okay, in policy terms, I'll try to wrap up with this and the limits of it. Where they've gone beyond what was already in the manifesto is saying that, and MacDonald made this the great thing in his speech to conference, that they would introduce worker representatives on the boards of companies with over 240 members, for 240 workers. In addition to doing this for the renationalized industries, etc., that they would do it for all companies. Moreover, reviving a little bit of the notion of workers' funds where profits would go, that was part of the attempt to change the Swedish Labour Party in the 70s, but not nearly as radical. Labour would set up funds in each corporation, workers' funds, where 10% of the profits would be used to buy shares in the company, which would be owned by those funds. And the dividends paid out of those shares would go to workers up to a maximum of £500 a year. If there were any profits left over in the fund after that, that would go to the Treasury to be used for social benefits. Unlike what was proposed in Sweden in the 70s, that is a cap of 10%. This is not, it would accrue to more and more and more, so that over a number of years, the workers' fund or the community fund would end up with 51% ownership of the corporation. Right? That's not in the proposal. Secondly, there's been an elaboration with the aid of a consulting company of the proposals around setting up a national investment bank and $250 billion of investment through it in building infrastructure and new industrial companies in Britain. It sounds like a lot, but it's not. It's over 10 years. It's more or less what the Liberals proposed in the last election here in Canada. But it's been elaborated through this Labour Party report, which is worth looking up. It's called the Financing Investment Report. And one of the good things about it is it looks at the way in which the publicly owned banks, which were nationalized in the 2008 crisis, would become part of the National Investment Bank, above all the Royal Bank of Scotland, and would be required to work with the Bank of England to actually allocate banking credit towards an economic planning industrial strategy. This is in detailed terms much more radical than you see coming out of most socialist governments in terms of planning. It actually talks about changing the structure of the Bank of England and even the location of some of its committees away from the City of London to the industrial city of Birmingham. So it could be working with the National Transformation Council that's engaged in this industrial strategy. MacDonald also has plans in the Treasury to set up a unit in the Treasury which would be peopled with staff who are favorable to nationalization and to workers' democracy inside it, because, as he said explicitly in his speech, the Treasury has always done everything it could to block anything like this. So there's an awareness of what Sam and I are stressing most in this book, of the need to think about how do you transform the state, that it isn't just a matter of policy. And MacDonald, after he made this speech, which was mostly about policy, came to the World Transformed, the panel I was on with, and talked in a most incredible way about the statism of the great old Labour Party reforms. Even criticizing Ken Loach's great film, 1945, on the 1945 Labour government, for not indicating the extent to which those reforms were statist, top-down, bureaucratic, etc. Again, so there's a tension there. The trouble is that this industrial strategy is very open to what we have called progressive competitiveness. The models explicitly offered are not only Germany and Sweden as export competitive industrial successes, but Singapore, South Korea, the United States, because of the way the Defense Department fostered the internet, or biotechnology. And this is, of course, extremely naive social democracy, of which there are loads of people in academia. And they are rushing into the Labour Party policy apparatus to offer that kind of advice. One partly understands that you're so dependent on the City of London for whatever surplus you get, given the way Britain's export competitiveness and manufacturing has been totally decimated, given that North Sea oil no longer provides much exports, etc., that you're looking for a way in order to be able, within Europe or not within Europe, right, to have some sort of balance of trade position. But there's very little conception of inwardly oriented production, of converting industry, above all defense industry, towards alternate forms of green technology, refitting. They talk about refitting, I don't know, what is it, 5,000 homes in Britain, but they don't link that at the moment very much to redoing the Clyde, where the ships are produced for the defense industry, to be able to doing that type of new production. And indeed, the unions are against this. Even Unite, the most left-wing union leadership, has forced the Labour Party not to adopt Corbyn's own position, which is to get rid of the nuclear submarine Polaris. The right wing of the party, of course, treats that as sovereignty. Nothing to do with sovereignty. They can't press that button without the Americans telling them to. On the contrary, it's evidence of colonialism of the most abject sort. Right? But the union leadership, which of course a number of big unions have members in that sector, but worse than that, Unite put out a pamphlet 2 years ago extolling the export competitiveness of Britain's defense industry. So you can see the thin ice that is being walked on here. On top of the fact that, as Steve pointed out in his great piece in Jacobin on Elizabeth Warren's proposals around worker participation on boards, it's usually the case where you have workers' participation on boards, including in Germany with Mitbestimmung, is that you have alliances between company managers and the worker participations on the boards. You know, the workers become part of, we need to be competitive culture in those firms. And you know, this is also an enormous contradiction. Now, what has to be said, however, is that there's enough consciousness, enough debate, enough radicalism in the party that this is not going to go away. Moreover, on the part of someone like MacDonald, he will promote it because he himself is aware and uncomfortable with it. That said, and he says more publicly than he probably should in terms of there immediately being on the run and pound if Corbyn's elected. You know, he also just this week said, I've never talked about capital control. Well, can you really do anything on the left in the world today without controlling the flow of capital? But the big problem in Britain is not the European Union, which wouldn't allow you to be in the European Union and have capital controls. That's not the real problem. The real problem is if you try to impose capital controls when the major portion of your economy, the most dynamic portion of your economy is based on the free flow of capital. You're cutting yourself off from whatever surplus you're getting from the world with which you need in order to have this national investment bank. This is the core contradiction. So it's clear now that even people who talked 2 years ago about the need to introduce capital controls the night we're elected are now saying no. These are Marxists inside the leadership, inside the unions, etc. It's clear that they are saying no, we'd have to wait, as we would have advised them to do, to see if there actually will be a run on the pound. Or whether, as McDonald says is the case, bankers are prepared to live with this. This really not socialist program. One oriented to infrastructure spending, one oriented to some industrial democracy, but not of the type that involves taking things away. And they long ago have discounted the fact that the public utilities will go back into public ownership. That isn't a big deal for them. Okay, I'll just end with this. This obviously one isn't going to get, especially of the British Labour Party, socialism in one government. And it would be the worst and ugliest thing if people who came to meetings like this because this is one of the few things going on in the world and they're excited about it, as soon as they see that the government isn't doing what they would like it to do, turn on it and accuse it of betrayal and capitulation, which I think is very likely on the left. This is a common disease on the left. If you're enthusiastic about it now, you better be enthusiastic about it with all of its problems, with all of its difficulties. And you need to be aware that that struggle will continue in the party. That there's no doubt. One young man said, I'm of the '89 generation. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the generation born in '89 was the generation that after the Iraq War was not at all interested in joining a Trotskyist party. The only game in town, it used to be the case you went to university, even a working class university like he did, in Nottingham, and the Labour Party was the last place you would join. Right? See, everybody joins now. Right? This is where the game is, and it just shows you how much this doesn't necessarily mean in terms of transforming the society. This is the case. But in Britain now, and I think it may be unique to Britain, this is where the political struggle will take place. If it continues, if the types of reforms that are introduced are open enough to further reforms, if the campaign apparatus that's been set up inside the Labour Party and been given £3 million, it's called the community campaign apparatus, a lot of momentum people are now working for it full time. If that is actually with that £3 million doing its work and linking Labour Party constituencies to the communities in a creative, substantive, vibrant way, then the thing is still moving. So the struggle will continue in it. It's not impossible that were Corbyn to get elected, that 20, 30, 40 Blairites would then create an independent party in order to prevent him from doing things like the recognition of Palestine. Which really is a sideshow to all of this, I have to say, because that isn't going to achieve the recognition of Palestine. It might have when Britain was still the colonial power there. But might get in the way of much more important and possible things inside Britain domestically, which would be possible. So that's likely. It's still a possibility they might create a party in the run-up to an election, but a lot of them probably would lose their seats, and they're afraid of doing that. So that's what's on the agenda now. They need time. It actually is preferable there not be a Brexit-triggered election in the short run. Precisely because you can see how limited the policies are. how little the education of the MPs has gone on. Even Momentum, only in a few places, is doing really useful community work. In some places in London, in some places in Bristol, but for the most part, they've been too caught up in elections or Corbyn's leadership election. One needs time to do this properly. In terms of lessons elsewhere, John's note really made me feel that I've got to be very careful when I say that one needs to look very seriously in the 21st century, given the failure of our left to create mass parties outside of social democratic and Stalinist parties, that this is where the game now is. I don't think that's the case in Canada, given the nature of the NDP. Partly because of the relationship with the unions is very different. But partly because there's been no trace left, I think, of what the waffle was about in 1970-71. Certainly not in any of the parliamentary, either at the federal level or at the provincial level, in any coherent way as there was around Corbyn. So, that this is not what I would advocate at all. I do think in the case of QS, which is arguably a social democratic party still, or might become one very easily, in the case of Syriza, the struggle needs to take place or the case of Die Linke in Germany, the struggle needs to take place in those parties. But, you're struggling there also within parties that are increasingly oriented, unfortunately, to becoming social democratizing. I'll stop there.
Thanks,